Before we get started, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment about which country you are from, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories that touch your heart and open your eyes. Your support helps us continue telling these great stories. Now, let's listen. In the heart of London, at one of the most somber and important events in British history, Lance Corporal William Evans stood like a silent sentinel, a symbol of dedication and commitment. The Queen's funeral procession was about to begin, and there he was, dressed in his ceremonial red tunic, polished black boots, and his tall, black bearskin cap. For over 15 years, he had been a proud member of the Queen's Guard. You might wonder what makes someone stick to a job like that, standing motionless for hours, in rain or shine, during state events, without a single word or gesture breaking their perfect stance. But for Evans, it was all about respect. Respect for the crown. Respect for tradition. Respect for the role he had chosen to play in a historic institution. This wasn't just a job for him, it was a lifelong calling. From the moment he signed up, he knew that his duty wasn't just to wear a uniform, but to embody everything that the Queen's Guard stood for. Being part of the Queen's Guard means more than just looking smart and standing still. It means upholding an image of the monarchy, one that represents stability, tradition, and history. Imagine standing at attention for hours on end. Every muscle in your body aches. You can't move, can't speak, and you have to remain as still as a statue. You're expected to do this flawlessly, day after day, year after year, even when you're exhausted or when the weather is miserable. And yet, Evans did it with a sense of pride and discipline that few could ever understand, but the real question is, why did he continue for so long? What kept him going all these years? The answer lies in his deep respect for the monarchy and its traditions. To Evans, the Queen was more than just a figurehead. She represented something larger than herself, the continuity of a nation, its values, its sense of identity. In a rapidly changing world, standing guard during these ceremonial moments gave him a sense of purpose. His uniform was not just fabric and buttons, it was a symbol of his commitment to his country. And when the Queen's funeral procession began, he would be there, right where he needed to be, keeping vigil as he had done countless times before. For Evans, the Queen's funeral wasn't just another royal event. It was the end of an era. The Queen had been on the throne for longer than most people could remember. In fact, Evans himself was born during her reign. He had never known a world without her. And now, as her funeral procession approached, the weight of that history pressed heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about the ceremonial duties he was performing. It was about showing the Queen the respect she had earned after decades of service to the nation. Standing guard that day, Evans wasn't just fulfilling his role as a soldier. He was participating in something bigger, a moment in history. His presence, still and dignified, would become part of that historical memory, and he knew that. Every time he stood there, rigid in formation, it wasn't just a physical position. It was an emotional one, too. His body might have been frozen in place, but his mind was racing. Every thought was about honoring the Queen's legacy. When you think about a funeral procession for a monarch, you might picture a solemn occasion, one full of tradition, ceremony, and reverence. But the Queen's funeral procession wasn't just any funeral. It was the passing of a figure who had defined an entire era of British history. For many people, the Queen was a constant presence throughout their entire lives. Her passing marked the end of an era, and every detail of her funeral procession reflected the importance of that moment. The procession itself was a highly choreographed event. Everything was planned down to the smallest detail. It wasn't just a parade or a funeral, it was a representation of the respect, love, and admiration the people had for their monarch. For Evans and his fellow guards, this wasn't just another duty, it was an honor. And for those of us watching from home, it was a chance to say goodbye to a monarch who had been the heart of the nation for so long. Evans stood at his post along the route, his rifle in hand, his white-gloved fingers wrapped tightly around the metal. His scarlet tunic gleamed in the overcast light, the gold buttons and white belt shining in stark contrast to the sea of black suits and dresses surrounding him. He had been in the Queen's Guard for years, but this moment felt different. The Queen, the woman who had reigned over Britain for so long, was gone. For Evans, this wasn't just about ceremony, it was about paying his respects. He was part of a long line of guards who had served their monarch in the same way, keeping vigil during these important moments in history. His stance was a representation of everything that was important about the monarchy. It wasn't just about standing still, it was about remembering, honoring, and respecting a life dedicated to the service of the nation. The crowd around him was massive. People from all over the country had gathered to witness this final farewell. And yet, in the midst of it all, Evans remained completely focused. He couldn't let the noise or the emotion of the day distract him. His training had taught him to block everything out, to be the steady presence that the Queen's Guard was meant to be. But even as he stood there, motionless, a deep sense of grief settled in his chest. He had known the Queen only through his service, but like everyone else, he felt her loss deeply. In this moment, standing there on the streets of London, Evans wasn't just a soldier. He was part of something much bigger than himself. The Queen's funeral procession wasn't just a passing of a monarch, it was a passing of an era. And as Evans stood there, representing the very best of British tradition, he knew that this would be one of those moments people would remember for years to come. It was history in the making. And Evans had a front row seat to it. As the Queen's funeral procession approached, Lance Corporal Evans felt the weight of not just his duties but of a deeply personal promise he had made. It wasn't something most people might think of when they picture a soldier standing guard, but Evans knew that some promises went beyond the usual rules. Years ago, when Evans was still a young, fresh recruit, he had met Declan Shaw, the Queen's long-serving footman. Shaw was no ordinary servant, he was a man who had devoted his entire life to the monarchy. Serving through decades of change, through triumphs and challenges. Evans had learned quickly that Shaw wasn't just a man in a uniform. He was a man with a heart full of loyalty, dedication, and an unwavering respect for the Queen. One afternoon, as Evans was learning the ropes of his new role in the Queen's Guard, Shaw had stopped by to offer some advice. The younger guard was struggling with the hours of standing still, and Shaw, noticing his discomfort, had leaned in and shared a simple but wise tip: wiggle your toes inside your boots, lad. No one can see, but it keeps the blood flowing. It was a small gesture, but Evans never forgot it. That advice, as simple as it was, formed the foundation of a unique bond between them. As the years passed, Evans and Shaw crossed paths frequently at Buckingham Palace. The younger man, now a seasoned guard, would often find Shaw in the quieter corners of the palace, offering him a respectful nod or a warm greeting. Shaw had become a sort of mentor to him, sharing stories of his own experiences during the early years of the Queen's reign. These stories were not just about royal events but about the heart and soul of the royal household. Evans came to admire Shaw not just for his service but for the grace with which he had carried himself throughout it all. One day, during a quiet garden party, Shaw had confided in Evans about his deteriorating health. He had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, and the doctors had given him only a short time to live. Shaw had expressed a deep, personal wish to see the Queen one last time. When the time comes for her final journey, I fear I may not be able to be present as I should, Shaw had said. His voice was soft but filled with a quiet urgency. I give you my word, Mr. Shaw, Evans had promised, his voice filled with the same solemnity he would use when speaking to a superior. If that day comes, I'll make sure you can pay your respects. Evans had meant every word. He knew that Shaw's health was failing, and with the growing crowds for the Queen's funeral, Shaw's frailty made it impossible for him to get close to the procession on his own. Evans knew this was a promise he would have to keep, no matter the cost to his own reputation or career. That promise was more than just a simple gesture, it was about loyalty, respect, and understanding the deeper bond between a servant and the crown. As the funeral procession neared, Evans' focus shifted from the ceremonial duties of his position to something far more personal, Mr. Shaw. From his place in the guard, Evans could see the elderly footman struggling against the crowd. Shaw, though once strong and sure-footed, was now frail and weakened by illness. He was struggling to maintain his position, swaying slightly as the crowd pressed in around him. Evans' heart tightened as he watched Shaw's struggle. Here was a man who had served the queen loyally for over 6 decades, a man who had been there for every important moment in royal history. Yet, in this moment, Shaw was invisible to the rest of the crowd. No one seemed to notice his struggle, no one except Evans. For a moment, Shaw tried to maneuver his way forward, trying to find a gap in the sea of onlookers. But the crowd was dense, and Shaw, already weakened by his illness, wasn't able to find any relief. Evans could see him trembling slightly as he leaned against the barrier for support. It was obvious to him that Shaw was in pain, and that this might very well be the last chance Shaw had to pay his final respects to the Queen. In the distance, the procession was drawing closer, and Evans could see the royal family members walking behind the Queen's coffin, their faces somber and composed, as they made their way down the street. But for Shaw, the possibility of saying goodbye was slipping away. He was being crushed by the weight of the crowd, unable to find the space he needed to honor the monarch he had served for so long. Evans looked again at Shaw, his heart heavy with the promise he had made years ago. The procession was now only moments away from passing, and Shaw was still struggling to maintain his position. In that moment, Evans had a choice to make, a choice that would test his sense of duty and his commitment to the promises he had made. Could he continue standing still, following orders and maintaining his perfect posture as a member of the Queen's Guard? Or would he break protocol, as difficult as it was? To help the elderly man he had promised to aid, Evans knew what he had to do. The Queen's funeral, important as it was, couldn't take away from the commitment he had made to Shaw. His duty to the Queen was never in question, but his duty to a man who had served her with the same dedication he had, was just as important. And with that thought, Evans made up his mind. The decision had been made. It wasn't an easy one, but it was one Evans knew, deep down, he had to make. There was a promise he had given, one that wasn't just about following the letter of the law or the rigidity of his training. It was a promise to an old man who had devoted his life to service, a promise made when Evans himself was just a young recruit, and one he intended to honor despite the consequences. Standing at his post, Evans' mind raced as Shaw's frailty became more evident. The elderly man, who had given decades of his life in the service of the Queen, was now in his final days, and this might be his last chance to say goodbye. But there were rules. And those rules were sacred. As Evans stood there, his fingers gripping his rifle, his mind kept replaying the oath he had taken to uphold discipline. The Queen's Guard was not just about standing at attention, it was about embodying an unwavering commitment to the monarchy. Breaking protocol, especially at such a significant event, could have severe consequences that could end his career, and more importantly, it could lead to the disgrace of the very institution he had dedicated his life to. Yet, in the corner of his eye, Evans could see Shaw, struggling, barely able to hold himself upright against the mass of people around him. The procession was drawing closer. The weight of history was bearing down on Evans as he realized that Shaw would not be able to witness the final farewell to the Queen unless something changed. Shaw's time was running out, and Evans' decision was now about more than just military protocol. It was about humanity. For a split second, Evans glanced over at Captain Mason Croft, his commanding officer. The captain, with his hard, unyielding gaze, stood at attention like a statue. He was always one to follow the rules without question, a soldier's soldier. There was no room for deviation in Croft's world, but Evans knew that sometimes, in life, you had to choose between what was right and what was expected. He took a deep breath, his training kicking in as his mind went into autopilot. It was a soldier's decision, but it was also a man's decision. The sacrifice of his career, the discipline of his service, was a heavy cost, but it was one Evans was willing to pay to fulfill his promise. With the precision of years of training, Evans executed a flawless about-face, a move that, in any other context, would have been seen as part of the ceremony. It was smooth, practiced, and so well executed that, for a split second, it almost seemed as though it was part of the approved protocol, an action that the public couldn't even question. But then Evans took a step forward, and everything changed. As he began to move away from his post, Evans was aware of the shift in the air. The crowd parted instinctively as he approached. The scarlet tunic and towering bearskin cap were unmistakable. even in the sea of people. Evans didn't rush, but he didn't hesitate either. He moved with purpose, stepping through the crowd toward Shaw. It was a moment that would never be forgotten. For those around, it must have appeared as if something extraordinary was taking place. Guards had always been a fixture of London's ceremonial life, and to see one break formation, to see a soldier, who had sworn to uphold the strictest of codes, stepping out of line, was an anomaly. The air seemed to hold its breath. Even the other guards, at their posts, stood frozen, watching the unfolding scene. Evans felt the tension rise, but he didn't falter. He was following his heart, guided by the weight of the promise he had made. As he moved through the crowd, Evans could sense the subtle, unspoken tension among the other guards. They knew something was happening, but they were trained to be silent observers, not to intervene. Evans arrived at Shaw's side, the frail old man still struggling, his breath coming in short, labored gasps. There was no need for words, none were allowed in that moment. Evans simply extended his arm, offering Shaw the support he needed, while maintaining his grip on his rifle with the other hand. With the careful precision of his military training, he gently guided Shaw forward, his posture never faltering, his dignity never slipping. As Evans led Shaw to the front of the crowd, a path seemed to open before them, as if the sea of people recognized the gravity of the moment. People shifted aside respectfully, understanding that something rare, something extraordinary, was happening right before their eyes. For Evans, it wasn't just about protocol, it was about ensuring that Shaw, a man who had served the Queen for over 6 decades, could pay his final respects in a way that honored his life's work. The crowd watched in silent respect as Evans brought Shaw to the front. Shaw, though frail, stood straighter than he had in months, his eyes glistening with gratitude. He had been given something that no one else in the crowd had, a moment to say goodbye to the Queen, to honor the woman who had been at the center of his life's work. Evans stood by Shaw's side, his back straight, his eyes forward, the only outward sign of his emotional struggle being the slight tightening of his jaw. As the Queen's coffin passed in front of them, Evans could feel Shaw's hand trembling against his arm. The old footman, who had served in the palace longer than Evans had even been alive, lifted his hand in a final salute to the Queen. It was a gesture that spoke of decades of loyalty, of devotion, of service without question. For a brief moment, Evans felt a quiet bond between them, a shared understanding that transcended the boundaries of soldier and servant. It was a moment that would never be captured in any official record, a fleeting connection between two men who had dedicated their lives to the monarchy in different ways but with equal devotion. Months later, the Queen's portrait was unveiled in the Grand Hall of the palace, a painting capturing her warmth, dignity, and quiet strength. Evans stood among the assembled guardsmen, resplendent in their uniforms, his posture proud but reflective. Among them, his face was known, not just for the medal he now wore discreetly on his chest, but for the story that had quietly passed from soldier to soldier, footman to footman. Mr. Shaw had passed peacefully 2 weeks after their final visit, his last days made brighter by the knowledge that he had not been forgotten, that his lifetime of loyal service had meant something. At the small private memorial held by palace staff, Evans had spoken briefly, not as a soldier, but as a friend. He had spoken of Shaw's quiet dignity, his tireless devotion, and the unspoken bond they had shared in that final act of tribute to their Queen. Evans would go on to serve with the Queen's Guard for many more years. His record bore the mark of his infraction, but also the citation for exceptional service. More importantly, he had become a quiet symbol within the ranks, a reminder that the strength of tradition comes not just from the rules, but from the people who carry them forward with heart and conscience. And every year, on the anniversary of the Queen's funeral, Evans would visit the same quiet spot along the procession route. He would stand for a moment of silence, remembering Mr. Shaw's salute, the moment of shared understanding, and the choice that had changed everything, because sometimes, a single step out of line, done for the right reason, can echo louder than 1,000 steps in perfect formation. The Queen's Guard, like the monarchy itself, was built on tradition. But traditions, Evans had learned, could evolve. And in that evolution, it was the human connection, the ability to serve with heart and soul, that made the Guard, and the monarchy, truly great. As the sun set over London, Evans stood tall, proud to wear the uniform, knowing that the true measure of a soldier's worth wasn't in the perfection of his formation or his ability to follow the rules, but in his ability to serve with dignity, loyalty, and compassion. As the days passed, Evans found himself reflecting more on the events that had unfolded, the decision he had made at the Queen's funeral, the consequences he faced, and the unexpected recognition he had received. The experience had challenged everything he had believed about duty, loyalty, and the role of a soldier in the Queen's Guard. For years, Evans had been trained to follow the rules, to stand firm and unwavering in his duty. He had learned that discipline was not just a principle, it was a way of life. It was what defined the Queen's Guard, a tradition that stretched back centuries, and it was a way of honoring the monarchy and the people it served. The rules, in many ways, were sacred. They were a form of protection, a means of maintaining order and ensuring that the dignity of the institution remained intact. But as Evans thought back on that moment when he broke formation, he began to see things in a new light. It had been a decision born not of disregard for the rules, but of a deeper understanding of what those rules were meant to represent. The Queen's Guard was not just about standing motionless for hours or carrying out ceremonial duties, it was about service, loyalty, and respect. And sometimes, Evans had come to realize, those values meant that the letter of the law had to be bent, even broken, for the right reasons. He had chosen to break protocol to help an elderly man, a man who had devoted his life to serving the crown. Shaw had given everything to the monarchy, and Evans, in turn, had given everything to keeping a promise he had made. In doing so, Evans had honored a deeper form of duty, one that went beyond military discipline and into the heart of human compassion. He had made the difficult choice to prioritize Shaw's dignity and his ability to say goodbye to the Queen over the rigid demands of his post. It was a decision that could have cost him everything, his career, his reputation, his place in the Queen's Guard. Yet, despite the punishment he received, Evans knew he had done the right thing. The royal family's acknowledgement of his actions had only reaffirmed that his decision had been in line with the very principles he had sworn to uphold. It was a reminder that true service wasn't about blindly following rules, but about understanding when those rules should be set aside to do what was right. The question lingered in Evans' mind long after the funeral procession, long after the consequences had been dealt with, and long after he had returned to his duties. When should compassion take precedence over rules? When should duty be shaped not just by the letter of the law, but by the spirit of it? Evans couldn't help but think of the countless men and women who served in the military, in government, in public service. He thought about the ways they, too, followed rules and traditions, often with great sacrifice and discipline. But he also thought about the moments when those rules, though important, might not be enough. There were times when rules could be cold, unyielding, and detached from the human experiences they were meant to serve. In those moments, perhaps the true test of a person's character wasn't in their ability to follow orders, but in their ability to act with empathy, to break free from the rigidity of protocol in favor of what was truly right. Evans realized that, in the end, it wasn't just about breaking the rules, it was about understanding when to do so, and why. It was about recognizing that duty to others could sometimes mean stepping outside the prescribed boundaries of conduct. His action, while a breach of protocol, had been motivated by the kind of service that transcended military regulations. It had been motivated by human decency. He found himself asking, when faced with an individual's need for compassion, should we always prioritize the rules? Or should we allow ourselves to listen to that inner voice, the one that tells us that a moment of kindness or respect is worth more than any punishment that might follow? These were the kinds of questions that Evans had begun to wrestle with, and he knew that his decision had ignited a broader conversation within him. It was one that might never have a clear-cut answer, but one that would stay with him throughout his life. Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to hit like and share it. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring videos. Thanks again and see you in the next one.